secrets of the past are all around us, hidden in our streets, buried under our feet. And in this series, I'll be uncovering those secrets as I explore Britain's most historic towns. I'll decipher physical clues. Look at that. It's covered with lizard-like scales. And get to know some extraordinary characters who are often overlooked.
He operated like a spy master. They lied, they deceived, they cheated.
With the help of Ben Robinson's Eye in the Sky, I'll discover which towns across the UK reveal the most about each period in British history and find out how those stories still resonate today.
3,880.
More and more individuals are still dying from the plague.
Oh my goodness. From the adventurous Elizabethans to the elegant Georgians, from medieval knights through to the height of empire, I'll tell the story of an era through the story of a single town.
Today, I'm in the town that for a century provided the brutal force that created the British Empire
It really is sort of a thriving war machine.
and launched Britain's most celebrated hero into an epic battle with Europe's greatest powers.
By the time we get to Trafalgar, Nelson has attained this semi-godhood status.
A town that epitomised the unimaginably cruel treatment of the poor.
There's an 8-year-old that gets put on one of the prison hulks and he gets 7 years for stealing 12 shillings worth of copper.
And where the Empire's figurehead formed a relationship that scandalised the royal family.
Victoria is not going to be silenced or bullied. You are all racist. She calls them racialist.
Does she? If you want to understand Britain's relationship with its navy, its monarchy, its empire, Portsmouth is the place to come. When I come to Portsmouth, I'm always struck by its energetic sprawl. It is the most densely populated city in the UK outside London, with over 200,000 inhabitants speaking 100 different languages, all concentrated on and around Portsea Island. The city's new high-tech beacon is the glorious sail-like Spinnaker Tower. But it's the ocean and ships which still dominate the view. Every year, millions of travellers pass through this city en route to its ports. Ships set off to France and Spain, hovercraft to the Isle of Wight, and smaller craft sail off to who knows where. But the biggest ships here belong to the institution which has shaped this city through the centuries. Portsmouth is every inch a navy town. There's been a settlement on the southwest corner of Portsea Island since the late 12th century. But it was the Tudors who decided that the large protected harbour at the mouth of the Solent was the perfect location for a naval base. But it was over a roughly 100-year time span from the Napoleonic Wars through to the First World War that Portsmouth really gained its status as the most important naval port in the world. It was the powerhouse of the British Empire. From here, the Royal Navy spearheaded Britain's mission to become the most powerful nation on Earth. And astonishingly, from the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805 through Queen Victoria's 60-year reign, up to the shocking birth of the modern era in 1914, it succeeded. This island became the greatest modern superpower, violently establishing an empire that encompassed nearly a quarter of the world's total land area and population. It brought obscene wealth to a few and unimaginable misery to millions. We're at a point in time where we're re-evaluating empire and coming to terms with some deeply uncomfortable truths about what our country did in the 19th century. Today, if we see a country exploiting, even invading another, we see that as deeply objectionable, and yet that is part of our history. Now, the Navy
was crucial to that empire-building business. And aerial archaeologist Ben Robinson is taking a look at why the Navy chose Portsmouth as its base.
I've got a great view of old Portsmouth here and the harbour, a wonderful natural harbour based on a drowned river valley with deep channels running into it. But the real secret to this place is just coming up now, the Isle of Wight, there on the horizon. This creates a magnificent natural barrier, and it prevents the worst of the weather, the wind and the waves crashing into this embayment area, the Solent. This is a perfect place to base your navy.
Geography may have made Portsmouth a natural choice as the home of the Royal Navy, but global politics brought Portsmouth centre stage in the 19th century. I'm meeting historian Dr. Carl Bell to understand the forces that stood between Britain and world domination.
Carl, what was Britain's place in the world at the beginning of the 19th century?
So Britain is in the middle of a 25-year war with France. France is its major rival as both of them emerge as the dominant imperial powers of the age. And the Napoleonic Wars leads to a very strange situation whereby you have Napoleon's mighty armies controlling the continent and yet very weak at sea. And you have Britain with this massive naval power but very weak army.
If you're trying to maintain an increasingly globalized empire, surely naval power is where it's at.
Right. I mean, that's vital to Britain's expansion as an empire after its loss of the American colonies. Britain's interest is fending off invasion from Napoleon and then also using their naval supremacy to start expanding their empire in new directions, developing their holdings in India, newly discovered Australia and places like that.
If the Royal Navy was the chosen vehicle of British empire building, Portsmouth Dockyard was its engine. And by 1800, this had become the largest, most advanced industrial complex in the world.
Presumably 19th century Portsmouth docks would have been even louder than it is today.
Yes, it really is a sort of a thriving war machine. You've got about 4,000 people working here.
And that must have been a fascinating time because having had shipbuilding going on here for centuries, it's now being utterly transformed by the Industrial Revolution.
You have got the development of steam-powered mass production in Mark Isambard Brunel's blockhouse mill.
But that's not the more famous Isambard Kingdom Brunel.
No, it's his dad.
Right.
Mark Isambard Brunel was a French royalist who had to leave France during the French Revolution.
Oh, he's Brunel.
And while he was working on this, Isambard Kingdom Brunel was born in Portsmouth.
And as well as this manufacturing, there's R&D going on.
Yeah, you've also got the introduction of steam pumps to remove water from the dry docks that we're in at the moment. And then you also have circular saws being used so that they can cut timber faster as well.
The result of all this industrious innovation was a mighty fleet led by one of history's most iconic warships, HMS Victory. Launched in 1765, she was reconstructed in 1803, making her one of the most technologically advanced warships in the vast fleet of the Royal Navy. And at her helm was one of history's greatest, if least likely, naval commanders.
He's 5'4", he's blind in one eye, he's missing an arm, and perhaps most surprisingly, he suffers from crippling seasickness. I refer, of course, to Admiral Horatio Nelson.
But both ship and commander were to become icons of the British Empire after the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. I'm meeting historian Dr. Ryan Hanley on board HMS Victory to find out a little more about the reality of the man behind the myth.
The Nelson we know is this commander of the fleet. He's famous, but what's his background? How does he get there?
Throughout the 1790s, he's increasingly being seen as a bit of a rising star in the Royal Navy. But it's only after the Battle of the Nile in 1798 that it took it to another level. So by the time we get to Trafalgar, Nelson has attained this kind of semi-godhood status.
And here we are talking about the Battle of Trafalgar, sitting on the deck of HMS Victory. And I think it's one of those moments where you just feel that kind of physicality of history. And of course, Victory left from here, left from Portsmouth.
Absolutely, and when Nelson was making his way to HMS Victory, there were reports that crowds were lining the streets. There were people dropping to their knees and saying prayers of thanks that, you know, Britain had this legendary tactical genius going out and defending them from the horrors of a French invasion.
What was so crucial about Trafalgar? What did that victory mean for Britain?
It really secures Britain's sort of international supremacy in naval combat. It wouldn't be challenged seriously for maybe 100 years.
The Battle of Trafalgar became an imperial foundation myth. But, as schoolchildren learn by heart, Nelson died at Trafalgar, ensuring his status as a martyr of the British Empire.
With this martyrdom at the Battle of Trafalgar, you can understand why we still know his name so well today. But of course, there is another side to him. He wasn't a fan of the abolitionists, was he?
No, absolutely not. Slavery at the time was seen as something that was very beneficial to the Royal Navy, partly because it was known as the nursery of the Royal Navy, where a lot of young sailors on their first voyages would take part in the transatlantic slaving expeditions, and those sailors then could be fed into the Royal Navy. But secondly, because Britain's trade policy at the time meant that British ships needed to be protected by the Royal Navy, and that the profits that were generated could feed into tax revenue, which of course helped to support the war effort. But there's another reason that Nelson may have felt sort of supportive towards the slave system. His wife, Frances Nisbet, he met her in the Caribbean island of Nevis. He married Frances on a slaveholding estate.
So he was completely part of that plantation-owning, slave-holding slice of British society.
Absolutely. That was his social circle.
And he wasn't exemplary in his own personal life either, was he?
Now, we used to think that his wife was cold and unfeeling and uncaring.
Of course it's her fault.
Of course
Of course it's her fault.
Of course it was her fault. But in the past sort of 10 years or so, new documentary evidence has come to light that suggests that actually Nelson treated his wife very, very shoddily indeed.
How do you feel about him?
I think that we are mature enough now to perhaps dispense with the idea of a national hero. And for me, as somebody who spends a lot of time looking at the transatlantic slave trade, his connections are too many and too deeply held for us to continue to celebrate him straightforwardly as a national military hero.
I do think it's curious that history quite often feels as though it gets boiled down to this essence where we just remember a few important names, and if we're to learn anything from history, I think we need to take a more rounded approach. And that also involves looking away from just those heroes. So it's undeniable that Nelson had a decisive victory that paved the way for further expansion of the British Empire, however you feel about that. But what about everybody else? What about those ordinary British sailors?
I'm in Portsmouth to learn about the astonishing period when Britain became the world's greatest superpower. From Nelson's victory at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805 to the start of World War I in 1914. I've heard how Trafalgar secured a naval domination that drove the expansion of the empire. Now I'm keen to learn what life and death would have been like aboard the ships of the Royal Navy for regular sailors.
I've actually driven quite a way out of Portsmouth to an outpost of Cranfield University's Ordnance Testing and Evaluation Centre, but there's a very good reason for being here because this is one of the few places in the country where I can really get to see the harsh realities of life in the 19th century Navy.
I'm meeting Nick Hall of the Royal Armouries. He's got his hands on a brutal-looking example of 19th century firepower.
Tell me about this gun. This is a similar gun to the ones that would have been on the Victory then.
It's a replica that fires exactly the same weight of shot as the 34 12-pounders on HMS Victory at the Battle of Trafalgar. But we're very lucky today because no one's firing back at us.
Yeah.
And it's difficult, really, to make the leap of imagination, knowing that cannonballs just the same are flying in from the enemy. And
Terrifying,
so
yeah.
you'll be next to a crewmate who's suddenly blown to bits, and you carry on.
So hopefully what we're going to experience is the firing of a cannon like this, as would have happened on board the Victory, with all of the... How many cannons did it have on board?
Just over 100.
100 of them. So we're just going to get a glimpse of that. And we've got a fragment of potentially a warship that we're coming alongside over there.
The fragment of warship is 50 metres away and made of oak timbers that replicate the density of an early 19th century ship's hull.
And actually, we've got our amazing high-speed camera over there, so we'll capture it and we'll be able to slow it down as well. But I'm going to leave you to it. I'm going to retreat to a safe distance.
Load!
British gun crews at Trafalgar could load and fire their cannons every 90 seconds. They were the fastest gun crews in the world. Their speed and accuracy were vital. Defeat at Trafalgar would have meant French control of the Channel and the inevitable invasion of England by Napoleon's Grande Armée. But the weight of the shot fired by Victory in its first broadside alone was 1¼ tons.
Okay, all stations, 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1, fire.
Oh. I was ready for that and it still freaked me out.
This thunderous bombardment would continue for 5 hours. By the end of the battle, 4,408 French and Spanish sailors were killed and 2,500 wounded. 19 French and Spanish ships were lost. The British lost none. Director of Operations Trevor Lawrence is going to talk me through the damage cannonball fire did to ships and sailors on both sides.
Oh, Trevor, looks a bit different on the back here.
It certainly does.
So that's the exit wound.
This is very typical of what you see at the back of any sort of armour. Nice symmetrical hole at the back, much more broken up, and this spalling effect, these splinters flying off at high speed, and you can see we've got some on the ground here and also all over our witness screen.
So those impacts all over that, that's the wood that's
Yes, that's
thrown
the
off
wood
it?
that's come off here. I mean, the thing is with a cannonball, it's great for punching holes in things, but it's not too dangerous to people unless you get a direct hit from it. These would cause horrendous injuries all over the body.
It's enough to put anyone off, isn't it? But, you know, if Empire was going to continue expanding, there was a constant need for fresh recruits into the Navy.
During the Napoleonic Wars, the Royal Navy recorded the deaths of 103,000 sailors, but only 6,000 of them died in battle. The majority were lost to various forms of disease, and quite a lot of those could be picked up in any of Britain's sailors' ghettos during the 19th century. Places where sexually transmitted diseases also destroyed the lives of destitute women for whom sex work was a means of survival. I'm meeting historian Dr. Melanie Bassett in what used to be Portsmouth's sailor town.
So what would this road have been like?
Both sides, there would have been pubs, lodging houses, there's a brewery over that side, and Sailor Town spanned all the way from the Dockyard Gates, right on the waterfront, all the way up to the centre of town.
So a lot busier, actually, noisier than it is today.
Oh, yes.
In the 1850s, around 3,500 sailors were living in Sailor Town, an area that also housed 300 brothels.
That looks like a completely modern building.
Yes, so this is now the Royal Maritime Club. It's still a place where the Royal Navy would stay, but back in 1851, this was built as a dedicated lodgings for sailors.
So it's on the same site?
Yes, yes. Yeah. So this was set up as a way to stem the tide of the immorality. But what was interesting about it is that it became a landmark where prostitutes would then congregate to catch the men as they were coming out of an evening.
But the grim reality of life in all of Britain's ports was a million miles from the cartoonish images of drunken sailors and bawdy wenches in 19th century prints and movies we still watch today.
This is a time where you've got no contraception, safe sex doesn't really exist, and sexually transmitted diseases must have been absolutely rife.
So Portsmouth was identified as one of the areas to bring under the Contagious Diseases Act in the first of the acts in 1864.
So these acts are really motivated by trying to protect the health of sailors. What do they mean?
Well, they actually meant incarcerating women. Women in Portsmouth were incarcerated on average for 50 days.
50 days?
Yeah.
And presumably this act was designed as a deterrent to prostitution. Did it work?
What was found was that the women, once they had a clean certificate, they were able to go out onto the streets with their certificate and use it as a unique selling point to attract business over other prostitutes.
By the late 1800s, work in the new factories of the Industrial Revolution was providing a far more attractive alternative to a life at sea for the British poor. But the Naval Defence Act required the Royal Navy to be at least the size of the combined fleets of its two major rivals. That meant the Navy needed even more sailors, and help came from a brand new form of public relations created in Portsmouth.
This is Portsmouth New Theatre Royal, and I'm here for a very special performance. I can't wait.
What I'm watching is a magic lantern show.
It's really lovely.
Projected from a machine that was the most advanced of its kind in the 1890s.
Oh, this is fantastic. It's like very early animation. Oh, yes, so the power of images to transport you.
This is the IMAX of the Victorian era.
These are brilliant.
It's essentially just a bright light in a box with slides passed in front of it. But it creates astonishingly beautiful effects.
Oh, and it's blown up. And Nelson himself, he's almost saying your country needs you. Ah, and there's Nelson on his deathbed. So this is the creation of the Nelson myth. Really beautiful.
Jeremy Brooker is the man who's been treating me to this wonderful show.
Oh, Jeremy, that was amazing. I loved it. And I loved the live aspect of that. I knew that you were doing that back here.
The sophistication of this comes from the fact that all these three images converge on one point. So you're building up one composite picture on the screen.
I mean, for Victorians to go and see these places that you were showing me, you know, places that they wouldn't even dream of going to.
Typically, people probably didn't travel more than 50 miles from their birthplace in their whole life. So to see these pictures must have been more extraordinary than we can really imagine.
I thought the images of Nelson were fascinating. There's Nelson's death, and I think that was most powerfully represented in that slide where his dead body is being carried off, I think in the arms of Victory, is that right?
Yes, it's a sort of allegorical scene.
Yeah, which is very much bound up with the idea of Britannia and Britannia ruling the waves.
Well, absolutely, and I think all these themes come together, particularly if you think of Alfred West, who was based in Portsmouth, and he developed this entertainment which came to be called Our Navy. He had access to the Navy and naval ships, and people would allow him to take initially photographs, later on films, very much what we would call propaganda.
But of course, we still have Navy recruitment adverts. This is still going on. But even if they didn't sign up, even if they didn't join the Navy, perhaps they're going to go away from watching that with a sense of pride in the empire.
That was absolutely his intention. And in his lifetime, he was compared to Kipling. And the way that Kipling, with literature, he was doing the same thing in a different medium, but serving very much the same purpose. And it's a little uncomfortable, perhaps, today, in the same way that some aspects of Kipling are uncomfortable for us.
I think it's a great interest to have. I think if I was going to collect anything, it might be magic lanterns.
It's hard to think of anything more quintessentially Victorian than the magic lantern. Except that is, perhaps, for the person who gave the era her name.
There is one British monarch who's practically synonymous with the idea of empire, and that's, of course, Queen Victoria. And she was particularly fond of Portsmouth and the Isle of Wight.
I'm in Portsmouth, the town whose story is inextricably linked to that of the Royal Navy and the expansion of the British Empire in the 19th century.
If the British Empire had a poster girl, then it is Queen Victoria. She's practically synonymous with that myth, that image of Britannia. It's extraordinary to think that this one woman ruled nearly a quarter of the world's population, and her 63-year rule encompassed the apogee of Britain's interests overseas. But when it came to holidaying, she chose a staycation. She would have done this so many times, taking a trip from Portsmouth across the Solent to the Isle of Wight, just as I am now.
What drew her back was this place, Osborne House, the magnificent property her husband Albert designed himself in the classical form of an Italian palazzo, a style which belies a rather surprising interior.
Wow. Look at that ceiling. It's extraordinary. It's so ornate. This is all based on Indian architecture. There's just so much decoration everywhere, and it's kind of every Indian influence you could imagine, lots of different styles all kind of crammed together. I think that's Ganesh up there, that elephant-headed god. It's quite overwhelming.
The Durbar Room certainly reflects a passion for India, and it might also reflect another kind of passion. It was begun in 1890, just 3 years after Victoria met an Indian servant called Abdul Karim. I'm meeting historian and author Shrabani Basu in the magnificent public gardens of Osborne House. Her study of the private papers of the Queen's household revealed amazing new information about Victoria and Abdul's relationship.
Tell me more about Abdul Karim. You've studied him, you found these amazing diaries that nobody'd really looked at before. What was that relationship about? How did they come to meet?
He was sent as a Jubilee present. And this is
he himself?
He and there's another servant as well. So 2 of them are sent. And their only job was to stand behind her at table, look grand, and sort of represent empire. Very quickly we know, it's Abdul that's her chosen one.
He caught her eye.
And absolutely did. Charmed her, clearly. And within weeks, her world has changed. He makes her a curry. She eats her first authentic Indian curry and describes it as delicious. And guess what? Her favorite was chicken curry and dal. And so nothing's changed, really. It is interesting that she becomes very politicized and aware of Indian politics, thanks to Abdul Karim. The household, Victoria's own family, her son and heir, Bertie, Edward VII, then hates Abdul. They've done everything to get rid of him. He even tries to get rid of her on grounds of insanity, saying we might ask you to step down, which is
really
absolutely. I found this
for Abdul.
Because of Abdul.
Yeah.
And this is a little note in her doctor's diary. And nobody had seen it, I just found it. And I said, this is incredible.
As a historian, finding something like that, I mean, that's amazing. You've just suddenly opened a window onto the past that nobody's been aware of before.
It is. It's those moments you get goosebumps and you think, how could they do this? And they do. And then, of course, Victoria is not going to be silenced or bullied by her son or anybody else. So she gives them a earful, sends them a 30-page memo and says,
He's staying.
Abdul is staying. You are all racist. She calls him racialist.
Does she? And so when she dies, what happens to Abdul then?
Within hours of her funeral, there's a knock on his door, and they take everything that she's written, postcards, little notes saying, come and say goodnight to me, with little crosses for kisses. Take everything, and they make a big fire outside, and they burn it. He's treated like a common criminal. Not just him, all the other Indians are all sent back. I think Edward didn't want to see a turban anymore in this place. He didn't want to smell curries. They used to call them the Black Brigade. So anyway, that is the start of the Edwardian era then.
And this very intimate story of Victoria and Abdul, what does that tell us about the British Raj? What does it tell us about Britain and India?
Well, it tells us that it was a pretty racist setup because he faced real racism, so much racism. I think Abdul has got his place back because he was always painted as such a rogue. At the end of it, it's also a story about two human beings, a very lonely elderly woman who relates to a young man who, you know, just gives her a new sense of life, a sense of joy and friendship.
Osborne House gives us this incredible insight into Queen Victoria's relationship with India, and it's such a gorgeous, small palace. I can see why she loved coming here so much. Now, Ben Robinson is looking for clues as to how the royal family got here in style.
We've just launched a drone here in Gosport, just across the harbour from Portsmouth, and I'm on the hunt for a railway. And here, you can see the blue line coming down. That's the main railway line, and it terminates here at Gosport Station. Intriguingly, there's another line running from it. That's the line I'm interested in. Queen Victoria had this little extension of a line here running out to a private jetty. Could any evidence of this survive in the modern landscape? I think the drone's in about the right position now, so I'll have a look. Oh, there we go. They've got it. That is definitely the old station. There's two parallel buildings there, the arches, and you can see where the track used to run through. Now, I've lost it in the trees there, but wait a second. There it is again. There's still sleepers and rail lines there. And the car's just crossing a sort of speed bump, which is also on the line of the track. But here, this margin, this grassy margin, that is definitely the line of the track, and it's never been built on. Where does it go? That's it, spin round, and then it seems to terminate there. But according to the map, it's at this point that it went off. Yep, that's the jetty, that's the shape I saw on the map. So the Royal Station somewhere in here, the Royal Waiting Room. It's incredible to think that the route still survives. And people walk by this every day and maybe are not aware of its royal associations.
The royals may have arrived in style, but theirs was a lifestyle far removed from that of the British working class, for whom basic survival was a struggle. Poverty would often lead to petty crime, but falling foul of the law was something best avoided. I'm heading to Burrow Island, also known as Rat Island, which lies on the entrance to Portsmouth Harbour. I've come to meet an old friend, archaeologist Richard Osgood.
Now, Richard, I know you've been digging here for quite a few years. I'm really excited to be here, and it's completely different from what I expected, actually. So why are you here?
This is an island is owned by the Ministry of Defence, and I had a phone call from the Defence Police saying, can you come and deal with the human remains that are visible on the island?
Yeah.
So I went there expecting to find, I don't know, part of a sheep or a cow or something.
Yeah.
But they gave me a very obviously human skull in an evidence bag, and I had a quick look around the island, and you could see that there were skeletons eroding from this cliff face.
Seems a bit of a weird place to have a cemetery.
It is odd, because it's not consecrated ground either, so this isn't a kind of religious area. But the question is, why put them here?
Do you have an answer?
Well, I think it's very difficult to tell because the diseases don't remain on the human bones, but I think these probably are people that have died of the diseases of the time.
Can I get a closer look then?
Yeah, let's have a look.
Human remains were first uncovered here by heavy storms in 2014. So far, Richard and his team have recovered the skeletons of 22 individuals, including the remains of one child.
There we go. So this is an adult. And you can see there's quite a lot of wear on those incisors in the front. But it's quite a robust-looking jaw, isn't it?
Yeah.
Quite a prominent chin.
Early indications from the labs suggest that the burials took place in the mid to late 1800s and that none of those buried here were over 40 years old.
Oh, safely take our masks off now we're away from the dig. So that mandible, I'm pleased with that. So that's nearly completed the skeleton. I would go for a probable male. So I think he's a young man.
They've all been males so far.
So who are they, Richard?
I think these are prisoners that were on these big prison hulks in the harbour in the late 18th, early 19th century. These are people that knew what Portsmouth was like when the Victory was an active ship. And I think these are local people that are committed, I mean, often very, very small crimes. For example, there's an 8-year-old that gets put on one of the prison hulks and he gets 7 years for stealing 12 shillings worth of copper. I mean, it's just such a brutal side of that part of British history.
Yeah, if you were in the wrong layer of society.
That this could be your fate.
I imagine there must have been infectious diseases, outbreaks all the time on those ships.
It's a real petri dish in many ways. You've got so many people in an enclosed space with these diseases that are absolutely virulent. It's probably the worst possible environment to have been based.
I think what you're doing is really respectful with these remains. I mean, these are people who probably had difficult lives, who probably suffered a lot, have ended up lost to history. So at least you're finding them and they're individuals again before they're reburied here.
They're a big part of the story of Portsmouth, I think.
Yeah.
The gruesome archaeological finds on Burrow Island act as a stark reminder that the riches of empire were enjoyed by only a privileged few, whilst life at the bottom remained bleak in Victorian Britain.
But the empire continued to expand, with the navy becoming ever more crucial. But what if an envious foreign power were to attack and strike right at the heart of Britain, at the home of the navy? It was time for Portsmouth to muscle up.
I'm in Portsmouth, the town that launched Nelson off to victory at Trafalgar and maintained a navy that ruled the waves with a ferocity that forged the biggest empire in history.
But other international powers were looking on enviously, and the paranoia was growing that Britain would come under attack. When the French developed impressive new steamships, that paranoia reached fever pitch. Britain needed new defences, and as home of the Royal Navy, Portsmouth was top of the list.
Ben has launched his drone to look for evidence of the fortification of Portsmouth, carried out after Prime Minister Lord Palmerston sank £10 million, an absolute fortune in the 1860s, into a line of monumental coastal defences.
Now, this is Southsea Castle. Here they used an existing castle as the centre point for the new defences. This square keep dates right back to the times of Henry VIII. But they didn't just use existing forts, they also built entirely new ones from scratch. And some of these were even out at sea. And here's Spitbank Fort. This was state-of-the-art in the middle of the 19th century. And they've actually found a purpose in the modern world as well. This one's a luxury hotel. Wait a minute, that looks like a swimming pool. Now we've got the drone a bit lower, I can see on the horizon there are 2 more forts. There's a great arc of forts going round right onto the Isle of Wight. And here at Fort Brockhurst, we've got forts well inland, a whole chain of defences. This must have been one of the most heavily defended places on the planet.
I've come to perhaps the grandest of all the Palmerston forts, Fort Nelson on Portsdown Hill, overlooking the Solent. And I'm meeting custodian Marcus Harrison on the highest point of this monumental 6-sided structure, one of the biggest forts ever built in 19th century Britain.
Amazing position for this fort. I mean, what a view. That is fantastic. But it does seem to be a very long way away from the harbour to be of any practical use, really.
It does, but the whole idea was to deny the French the high ground. Portsmouth Harbour is just under 4 miles away from here. If the French had landed either east or west of us, they could have taken this hill
Yeah.
and then bombarded Portsmouth, denying the Empire its greatest naval base. Britain was defending its navy by holding this hill.
So these forts form a kind of protective backup for the Navy,
Very
then?
much so, very much so.
Where does this idea come from, building what is effectively a big castle?
These are based on what they call the Prussian design, a continental system that laid down fire that ensured the enemy couldn't pass between them.
Right.
Because many people would argue, why on earth would you just not go round them?
So the firepower in these big forts
Yes.
was enough to basically cover the gaps between them?
Absolutely. So they would have flanking fire. These were massive guns. I mean, these 68-pound smoothbore cannon.
That is enormous. You know, when you compare that to the 12-pound cannon on the Victory.
Absolutely.
This fort was vital to the defence of Portsmouth and the Royal Navy, so it needed to be secure. Had any French forces evaded the crossfire from neighbouring forts, they were in for a nasty surprise.
What's this? Is it a training ground?
A little too small for that, but certainly large enough to accommodate the French, should they be daft enough to have come in at this point. These gates at each corner would have been locked, and open fire would have happened from these gun loops here and here.
So it's a trap?
It's a trap. The killing fields is what they're known as,
Oh.
and a nasty spot indeed.
But of course, this is all completely theoretical because it
Absolutely.
never happened.
Never
The
happened.
French never invaded.
They
so
never invaded.
Is this a folly?
No, and Palmerston's follies are what they are known as by many, principally because of the huge expenditure of the state at the time to ensure that these were built and never used in anger. But the preventative measure, of course, should be considered.
You know, we still have these discussions about our defences today and say,
Very much
you know,
so.
is it totally unnecessary expenditure?
Absolutely. I mean, you only need look at Trident. These were maybe the Trident of their day.
So I don't know if we'll ever actually really know if these Palmerston forts were necessary, but what is for sure is that the British Empire was now under threat.
By the time the Victorian age came to an end in 1901, with the death of the Queen, nations around the world were building sea forces to rival that of the Royal Navy. The immediate threat came from Germany, led by Victoria's grandson, Kaiser Wilhelm II.
But then, a man called Jackie Fisher enters our story.
To find out more about this intriguing character, I'm meeting Nick Hewitt, Head of Collections and Research at the Museum of the Royal Navy.
And who is Jackie Fisher?
So Jackie Fisher is the first Sea Lord. He's the operational head of the Navy. What he is a technocrat. He's an innovator, and he does a root and branch reform of the Navy. He tears it all up and starts again. And perhaps the most visible way he does that is in the design of the battleships.
Including this one.
Including Dreadnought.
This is amazing.
Dreadnought is a game changer for naval warfare. She's a completely new design, and she's built here. She's built literally just over there underneath the
Yeah.
infrastructure for the aircraft carriers.
And these are the photographs from building Dreadnought herself, so 1905.
Yeah, so they photographed every stage. These things are the most complex piece of technology anywhere in the world at this
Yeah.
time. And Dreadnoughts become the currency by which nations measure their worth. They're the nuclear weapons of their day.
So does Germany start building essentially copies of it?
So what Fisher predicts happens exactly as planned. The Germans then start building their own Dreadnoughts.
Yeah.
They are constantly a bit behind.
So because Jackie Fisher took that risk, because he decided to invest in this new technology, we were slightly ahead of the game.
Yeah. So at the end of the First World War, there is no naval power to rival Britain.
And despite that victory and naval superiority, by the end of the First World War, Britain is bankrupt.
That's why they embraced the arms limitation treaties in the interwar period. There's just a huge sigh of relief that they're not going to have to keep up this pace of construction and development forever.
Is that really the end of empire then?
It's the start of it. It's that realisation that Britain can't really afford to be a world power anymore.
Yeah. And I think, you know, when we look at where we are now, we can look back at all this history and we wouldn't want to be that again.
It's the ebb and flow of world power status, isn't it?
The days of empire are long gone, but Portsmouth is still the home of the Royal Navy, of course, and will always be associated with that particular period of history, from the Battle of Trafalgar up to the outbreak of World War I.
In just over 100 years, Portsmouth would launch the fleet that would lay the platform for the biggest empire in history. See its streets awash with the drunken sailors who'd helped Britannia rule the waves. Welcome an iconic queen. Become one of the most fortified towns on the planet. And build the ship that changed the world.
Empire has become an uncomfortable truth as we try to come to terms with the human cost and the exploitation of that incredibly rapacious, expansionist period of Britain's past. But we cannot ignore history. We must face it. We must try to understand it. And that empire wouldn't have been possible without the Royal Navy, a navy that has long called Portsmouth its home.